Welcome to another episode of First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers. That 15th century Shakespeare phrase that drew raucous laughter at the time. And even today, when you bring it up, people think, yeah, it's not a bad idea. Maybe we could start wiping them all out one by one. I'm David Heffernan, and I've been practicing personal injury law here in South Florida for the last 3 decades. My goal behind this show is just simply to bring in friends of mine, other local lawyers, South Florida lawyers in varying aspects of the law, and to talk about different aspects of the law that have an impact on all of us. And this morning, I've got the great pleasure of bringing in not only a really, really good lawyer, but a very, very good friend of mine, classmate of mine. So I've known him for a long, long time. And by the way, one of the smartest guys I happen to know. This morning, let me introduce you to Will Morris. There you go. See?
Hey,
that's how you wrote it,
I was
right?
just looking around and see what you're talking about.
I mean, that's what your email said to say, right? No.
Oh, that's what I told you to say?
Exactly. I thought I wanted to make sure I read it right. So Will and I go way back to graduating law school.
My God, it was what, 91?
91. So let's talk a little bit about you and why did you go to law school? And then I want to kind of go through your journey because it's been interesting because you've gone huge firm to what you do now and covered all that base. But what was the interest in law for you?
Well, as I tell people all the time, I never really had a choice. I mean, ever since I was 4 and 5 years old, that's what I was always told I was going to be. So, I mean, for example, I was born in South America, in a place called Guyana. And I was born as a British subject, so to speak, and I spent some time in London, not only doing some studying but also working as a lawyer. When I went back home, and people asked me what I did for a living, and I told them I was a lawyer, nobody was impressed. Everybody was like, "Oh, okay, give me $100." So I mean, now it was not a choice for me, and. Yeah, we went to law school. I guess we started in '88.
Yeah,
and got out in '91. Then I went to from law school at UM. I went to New York and practiced at this large firm called Baker McKenzie. And
so let's talk about that because obviously you had decisions to make coming out, and you went big firm. I mean, about as big as you can go. You went to New York.
The world at the time, yeah.
You went to New York, got licensed in New York. Yeah. And tell me about the practice in a firm, and how big was Baker McKenzie at that time?
Well, Baker, if I remember correctly, at the time it had, I think, about 1,700 lawyers, close to 2,000 lawyers, around 50-something different countries in the world, and so it was humongous, and it was like typical. It wasn't actually, the truth of the matter is, it wasn't a typical big firm experience for me because I was the only person. I was the last person they hired in the litigation department, and so as soon as I got barred, I was arguing cases. My first case was in the bankruptcy court within a year. I was doing depositions and all kinds of cool stuff, which the other lawyers in big firms in New York, I mean, young lawyers didn't get that opportunity. I got a great story for you. This is how full of it I was. I mean, I remember this one time we go to this a hearing in federal court in New York, and you know how those big firms go to hearings. They go 5 and 6 deep. You have the lead partner, the senior partner, then you have me all the way at the end. And we're sitting there at the table, and they're arguing, and they're going forward. And the other side, maybe it was White and Case or some other big firm like that, and they had the same sort of setup. And the judge asked the question. Everybody's stumbling around with the answer. Just turns out that I was the one who researched that issue and wrote that part of the memo. And I spoke up. I spoke up in the middle of this, and you could see all the heads just swivel all at once.
Right. Who is that person? Is he with us?
Boy, I got my butt chewed for that. But I said, "Look, I knew the answer. What do you want me to do?"
I was loving it with big firms like that, though, because I did some pharmaceutical litigation in the past, and they would hire great local counsel, but then there'd be a hearing, and they'd come in, and again, it's like lining up against Family Feud. There's the guy, and by the way, the local guy knows more than any of them.
Exactly.
But they've flown in for a hearing, and I love it because they'd all fly in from New York, and we'd get a nice favorable ruling. Be okay, you guys have a nice flight back. You know. All right, so you do big firm, and then what draws you back to Miami?
It was sort of a personal family thing. My son, who was born when I was still in law school, we took him to New York, and he could not take the winter. The first winter, he spent weeks in the hospital. The second winter, he spent a couple of days in the hospital. And before the third winter got there, his mom said, "Nope, not happening," and brought him back to Florida. He was born here in Florida.
Okay.
So, and I stayed in New York for another year. And then after a while, I said, you know what, I need to be around my son. So I left. No plans to continue practicing law. It's just like I knocked around for almost a year not doing anything. And the great John Corranter, you know him, another friend of ours I went to school with, was working with Tom too at the time, and said this lawyer from New York who I went to school with is just knocking around doing nothing. Why don't you come bring him in for an interview? So I go to an interview because John requested I do that, and I sat there and said, "Listen, I don't care. I mean, you hire me, you don't, I don't care."
It's nice to go to a pressure-free interview where you're like, "Yeah, if you want."
I was bartending, doing all kinds of stupid, fun stuff, and then they were like, "Well, okay, fine, we'll hire you." And like they say, the rest is history. I went from that Tom Two's firm to another boutique litigation firm. And I'm not going to get into the story why I left them, but I just left it. One day I said, you know what, I quit, and I got up, and the next day I started my own firm. That was in 1999. So
and been doing it since then at Morris Legal.
I've been doing it since. Well, there were several mutations of that. It started off with J. Will Morris, PA. Then it went to Morris DuPont Mansfield. Then went to Morris DuPont. Then it went to Morris Barrow. Now it's just Morris Legal.
At least you're practicing with people you like now, right?
Exactly. It's funny. Yesterday I lost a hearing that I thought I should have won, and I how debilitating that could be at times. And
sure.
I sat there for about half an hour, and then I realized this is 10 o'clock in the morning. I quit. I got up and left. So I called my buddy David Howard. I said, you know what? I got fired. He goes, you got fired? I said, yeah, either I got fired or I quit because my boss is a real a-hole, and rather than curse him out, I just decided to quit. So I took the rest of the day off, and it was refreshing, and here I am.
Right. Well, good.
You have to lick your wounds and come back.
It is a profession where you certainly can't win them all, and the most devastating I think is those that you think absolutely should have, and I mean. It's what appellate courts are for, and judges try to do the right thing, but can't say that we always agree with them.
I know judge came at me from left field. Didn't see that coming. I thought, wow, okay.
All right, let's talk about your practice because it sort of evolved, and you focused a lot on consumer law.
Yeah,
and I think with that, there's a lot of things, the effect of the pandemic and everything else. So let's talk a little bit about that. What happens?
I was fortunate enough that I saw the handwriting on the wall back in 2008, what was happening at the advent of the foreclosure boom. And I got involved with that, and I started doing foreclosure defense, and had huge amount of employees and huge amount of clients. And when that dried up, and that sort of led to the mutations of the firm, that dried up, and here I am back to where essentially almost where I started before, but liking it better. So I think in the beginning of the pandemic, when things started shutting down, and I started thinking, well, wait a minute, this might be, and again, only a lawyer could say this. I mean, there's going to be another boom of foreclosures. But the difference between now, and back in 2008 was, even though the banks were being bailed out, they weren't necessarily in 2008 and given monies from the federal government. They weren't necessarily passing that down on to the homeowners, and homeowners were still out of jobs, and homeowners were still not being able to afford their their mortgages. And so foreclosures were the thing of the day. The pandemic was a little bit different because I don't see that same sort of a boom to the foreclosure market, because not only was everybody getting bailed out by the banks, by the government, but everybody was put in a holding pattern. I don't know what's going to happen in the next year or so, but there's a lot of people who've gotten deferring on their mortgage payments, and people haven't paid their mortgages since the beginning of the pandemic. I don't necessarily know what's going to happen once those deferments stop. I mean, certainly the economy looks as though it's not as bad as it was in 2008. It certainly looks as though it's bouncing back, and certainly there's a whole bunch of jobs available. And, if you depending on who you listen to argue, there's not enough
Right.
people for those jobs. But so it's not really an economic crisis now. It's going to be just a crisis of whether or not the banks are going to say, you know what, for the year or change in which we deferred your mortgage payment, we're just going to tack it on to the end and not say to you, you know, you need to come up with a $50,000, $60,000 to bring your mortgage current. I don't think that's going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, then I don't necessarily foresee the same kind of foreclosure boom that occurred back in 08, 09. So,
So going back to 08 and 09, when that boom happened, I mean, what was everything going on with all the robo signing? Because mortgages were just getting passed back and forth,
right,
you know, to banks. You take out a mortgage with Bank A, and by the time anything happened, it was 10 banks later that has your mortgage.
right. Sometimes in the closing, and right after the closing, it gets transferred. And what happened was, and all mortgage documents give the lending bank the right to transfer it to whomever they want. What happened was that all these mortgages got bundled, you know, what they call tranches, and you'd have well-performing mortgages and poorly performing mortgages all put into a bundle, and they were being sold in the secondary market. But when the problem is when one of the bad mortgages in that bundle went bad, then the whole bundle goes bad, right?
Okay.
And people who were buying those bundles in the secondary market started getting squeezed by it, you know. And then when you add to that the economy, the bottom falling out and people losing jobs, and more mortgages became non-performing, then those tranches, that they were called, those tranches of mortgages that were bundled together became almost worthless, you know, and banks were left holding the bag. You know, I mean, not to feel sorry for them. I mean, they're the ones who created the problem.
Right. They set it up.
because they wanted more mortgages to put in these tranches to sell in the secondary market. That's put pressure on the mortgage brokers to qualify anybody who with a pulse to qualify for a mortgage. I mean, I had situations where people are making $40,000 and $50,000 a year and carrying $250,000 and $750,000 mortgages. There's no way that could happen. You know, the general rule is you should only be paying 30% of your income to service a mortgage. Well, if you're paying 200% of your income to service a mortgage, you know, you know,
Could be a problem. The math doesn't work.
the math doesn't work, you know. And then people started thinking, well, you know, I used to call them. I had a radio show back then. I used to call them trumpets. People thinking they were going to become real estate tycoons, you know, to buy a property and flip it, in which a lot of people made a lot of money for it. But when the bottom fell out and you wind up holding a piece of property, it's not worth what you paid for it. Then what do? You're going to go into foreclosure, right? So, I mean, it started a domino effect. Look, there's a lot of blame to go around. I mean, sure, you can blame the homeowner for getting in a situation where they couldn't afford a mortgage to begin with. Sure, you can blame the bank. Sure, you can blame the regulations. You can blame a whole. But you know, it was like a perfect storm, a confluence of all these small and seemingly insignificant events that created this big problem, and hence the 2008, 2009 foreclosure boom. You know,
All right. So let's fast forward to today, and you say obviously foreclosures are way down, and we don't see that. But what does a homeowner do that, let's say, lost a job during a pandemic, or unable to work, or you know, you've got people still long-term effects of COVID that haven't been able to go back to work? They get behind. What's their best option?
well, like I was saying earlier, luckily there's a lot of banks were willing. I don't know if they still are, and there were certain moratoriums in place that stopped foreclosures, you know, on the federal level, and there were many states had that as well. A lot of banks did that with a deferring of the mortgage payments. You know, I'm not ashamed to tell you I took advantage of that. Why not, right? So, the question is going to become, once these deferments run out, what the bank decides to do. No, there's no rule that says the bank could say, well, we'll roll it into the back. The same way there was no rule that said back in 08 or 09 that you were entitled to a modification. There's no entitlement to it. There's no entitlement to the bank forcing the bank to put what you owe, what you haven't paid in the last year, and the back end of the mortgage. So it'll all depend on what these individual banks decide to do. I mean, if they decide not to and start putting pressure on people to come up with this kind of money, then we've got a major problem. And I imagine the government will have to step in and do something about it. Otherwise, we're back, maybe not to the levels of '09 and '08, but we're back to a little bit of a boom in foreclosures. You know, I mean,
is there a difference because now, I mean, you go back to '08, '09, banks had the ability, like you're saying, it's their option. They can either work with you or they have the ability to foreclose on it.
right.
But they didn't want to own a lot of these properties. The value wasn't there, everything else. Right now, the market's insane.
That's an interesting point.
And banks might want to say, hey, we can squeeze you now.
That's an interesting point. I mean, that's another part of the seemingly insignificant, the value of property is not necessarily insignificant, because the values of property have gone ridiculously high. I mean, it's almost unsustainable. It cannot be. It cannot be sustained. You know, I mean, there are banks now saying, look, we're not going to lend you money to buy this house because it doesn't appraise for the value you're paying. I sold my place before the pandemic, and was looking to buy one, and shortly we recognized that I couldn't, because the guy asked for 200. You go to the guy and say, okay, I'll pay you 200. The next day, a guy comes and says, I'll pay you 210, and you're right. And here's the cash, and here's a briefcase of cash I got for it. And you're done. And so banks are now looking at these properties that are being sold and saying, look, we're not going to finance that because that property's not worth it. So there's a writing on the wall that says that the boom in the prices, they're either going to stabilize or have to come down. Now you make an interesting point, because of that very same fact, that might motivate banks to foreclose and get REOs, what's called real estate owned, when the bank itself owns the property, or selling the courthouse there. But selling on the courthouse that doesn't do the bank much, because all they're entitled to really is what they're owed, right? Right, and the surplus goes to the homeowner, right? The difference between what the property sells for and what you have to pay the bank off is called a surplus, and it goes to the homeowner. So unless the banks decide to take it back, which again happened a lot back in '08, and which might happen again, because if the bidding process on a foreclosure sale pushes the price above that which people are willing to pay, and nobody buys it, then it goes back to the bank.
Right.
So so the bank has to. There's almost a two-step approach for this to become an REO, real estate owned property by the bank. So while there might be incentives for the bank to foreclose, there's still a bit of a process to go through so they can reap the benefits of that profit. And by the way, which brings me to another point. You had a question?
Yeah. Well, no. I want to talk about now. You talked about a moratorium on foreclosure. So what is the status? Can they be filed, or is there sort of a freeze on that?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I mean, it's like, it's like
I'm asking you.
Well, no, look, the federal government can put moratoriums of foreclosure on any property that's financed by FHA, a federal agency, and then it's up to the states to determine whether or not these particular states will put a moratorium on foreclosure. I don't think there is one. Right. Last I checked, there wasn't. The reason I say it depends on who you ask. Like, for example, there was a moratorium on evictions, right?
Right.
And obviously on the federal level that expired, and this different state, there was a statewide moratorium on evictions, and which expired, and then the local governments have their own. The local municipalities have their own moratoriums. So while when the governor is saying one thing, and you have to go check your local your county to see whether or not that really applies to you. It depends. It's all over the place. So, but I think I've seen an uptick in evictions. A lot of residential evictions, and I don't think a lot of commercial evictions as well. I've seen an uptick in that, and because quite frankly, people weren't paying rent, and
right.
And even though some of the landlords took advantage of the benefit, those rental assistance programs that they had, that the federal government had, and even the state had, if you haven't been paying your rent, they still have a right to evict you.
Yeah, and that's a whole different dynamic, because again, the rental market is so sparse down here that if people can get their property back to get people to come in and pay it, they're going to do it in a heartbeat. So, and I know there's some litigation now because with the moratoriums on that, there were windows for a couple of days where it had lapsed and people filed right then and there, and now there's back in place, and I guess we'll leave that to the courts to decide.
I mean, it's all over the place. It really is. I mean, in the beginning of the pandemic, I had a guy come in and try to evict somebody from his residential property, and he got mad at me because it wasn't going anywhere. So he fired me and hired somebody else, and he still had it.
Right.
A year and a half later, I kept telling him, what would you have me do? Would you have me go down to the courthouse and sign these orders myself? I can't do it.
Right.
So a year and a half later, he's still at it. Still at it. Can't get it done.
What do you see going on? One of the byproducts of the pandemic, and you've been in big firms, but I know you do commercial work as well, is, everybody started working at home, and now at least from law firms, and I talk to people, a lot of people are going, hey, we don't quite need the space that we had anymore because we can have half work at home. We can do this. And I think that whole dynamic's changing. Well, where do you see that going?
Yeah, listen, it was inevitable. Once people start realizing, like you don't really necessarily need to get up, get dressed, and drive to a place, park, and get into an office space with a whole bunch of other people. I mean, the requirement to have it is big, expensive. Real estate, offices. You've seen those.
Well, that's your biggest nut, no question. Your overhead, that's space.
Ridiculous. When you realize you don't need that, and you can start cutting back on that. I mean, those big office buildings are going to start feeling the crunch. I mean, I don't see it going back to where it was before. I mean, I hope and I pray, and I'm sure you think that too. I hope the courts don't go back to that fully. I mean, sitting at your desk in your shorts and your tie and your jacket and shirt. I mean, and rather than driving, because I've always thought, you know how the courtroom is. You go in there, there's 50, 60 lawyers. You sit around for an hour and a half,
right?
5 minutes of the judge's time, and you think about it. This is like $5 million an hour being clicked away for nothing.
Right.
Everybody's sitting there waiting. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I see big firms not getting back, scaling down the space that they rent. I see. Yeah. I'm praying and I'm hoping that there's certain things in court that require your presence. I get that. You can't have a trial, which even though I've done a couple of Zoom trials. I mean, it's better in person,
100%.
Yeah, but ridiculous hearings, please.
But yeah, being able to do motion calendar, I agree with you 100%. Just makes perfect sense.
Absolutely.
To do it via Zoom. You're there. You can log in. I can be in West Palm Beach for a hearing, at 8:30 and in my office at the same time without killing all that time. Otherwise, it took a whole morning. And you're right.
Right.
Yeah. The funny thing is the one thing I've found though is with the Zoom hearings, it seems that lawyers are talking less before the hearings. Okay, because it's no big deal. I'll log in and so. Instead of working out things ahead of time, because they go, well, I don't have to drive and be in Broward at this time. Can we work it out? They have a discussion. Those discussions are sort of falling by the wayside a little bit because it's a Zoom hearing. I could just show up.
Right. That's an interesting point. Not only that, you could talk to each other before the hearing and make a whole lot of progress. That's an interesting point.
Well, that is true. Yeah. How many times have you worked out something in the hallway?
That's right.
Waiting to see the judge going, hey, come on, this is ridiculous. And you figure it out and you write up an order and you're out of there.
Right. That's an interesting point. Yeah, that is a casualty of the Zoom hearings. I agree. But you cannot beat the convenience of it. I mean, you really, really, really can't.
No, I think that will be one of the good byproducts that comes out of this. And we've talked about it on this before. I really do credit the Miami-Dade County judges. I think they've done a really good job of keeping things open and via Zoom, however, virtually open, but continuing to try to move cases during this time frame as opposed to just letting it all sort of stall.
Right. And they've implemented. I've always thought it's a bit of a good thing they've implemented a system that's similar to the federal court, where you have these case management deadlines right off the bat. 'Cause you know
Right.
how federal court works. The minute you file it, 2 days later, you're scheduling a trial. you know,
Right.
wait a minute, I just filed. Why are we scheduling a trial? But that's how federal courts move their cases along. And I see Dade County is doing that now, which is, I think, a little bit of a good thing. I mean, rather than having these cases languish.
No, no question. And I've always, it's funny. I've always told my students that, I'm like, yeah, the difference between state court and federal court is, in state court, you can kind of file and figure it out as it goes along.
Mm.
Federal court, you better have it wrapped, packaged in a bow and ready to go.
Ready to
You
go.
know, the day you file it.
Right? They don't mess around over there. I mean, it's I tell people it's like a real court, real court.
But yeah, I have seen now, with the Zoom. I mean, I don't think I've had this many case management conferences in my life, because what judges were just doing is they're just setting monthly case management conferences, going, okay, where are we at? What can we do to help? And pushing things.
Well, it's sort of like they have to, because you remember in the beginning of the pandemic, everything shut down. Nobody was doing
Right.
anything. And these cases, next thing you know, a 2019 case all of a sudden is 2 years old, right?
Right.
Just don't like that. So we have to do something to move these things along.
Wait a minute. You're not telling me it's not March 2020 still? That's usually the last date I remember. I saw a great meme. It's two guys running, and one guy's running here, and he goes, me still contemplating 2020. And then the guy behind him says, 2022, 4 months away. It's been a blur in there for some of this.
I tell people, do you remember April and May of last year? Jeez. I mean, I was the only guy coming. I came to work every day.
Right.
It was like a ghost town, because I soon realized I can't work from home. I have to be, get up and get dressed and go someplace.
Right.
And, it was a ghost town. It was like a strange, eerie, weird feeling, but we lived through it.
Yeah, we did. And hopefully we've learned, and hopefully we will grow and continue to grow, and be very interesting to see what goes on in the world of foreclosure and everything else, and just how it might become.
We'll see what happens, but there's a couple of variables that have to play out to see what happens there. I mean, banks hold all the cards. I mean, they do. The minute they have an opportunity to, they can say whatever they want to. And when in the middle of foreclosures and trying to do modifications, people couldn't understand, why would the bank want my property back? They don't care about you.
Right.
You think they know who you are?
Right.
You have coffee, you have beer with them. You're just a number on a piece of paper, and if it makes sense to them, that's what they're going to do.
Well, what advice do you have for a consumer who all of a sudden is in a situation they can't pay their mortgage? I mean, and I know banks aren't moving swiftly on it, but should they be proactive? Should they contact the bank? Should they contact a lawyer?
I think you should contact the bank. You think contact a lawyer and start talking about. I think banks will. The modifications are not dead. I mean, and so people should be proactive and contact their bank and say, listen, are we gonna put this money I owe you in the back of it? Do we need to modify this? They have to keep on it. I mean, or get your lawyer to keep on them, so that you don't get caught off guard when the bank suddenly says to you, hey, by the way, we need a $50,000 check, right? Otherwise we'll foreclose the next month. Nobody has that. You know what I mean? Nobody has $50,000. I mean, but the good thing about it is that with the property values going up, people are not going to be as underwater as they were back in 2008 when the property values fell. That was another variable that helped the boom. Property values fell. The guy who's going to flip a house, thought he was going to make $20,000 from that. Next, he's $20,000 in the hole.
Yeah, he's upside down in it. Yeah,
like that. And you can't do anything with it. So we will see what happens with the banks, what they decide to do. But the property values being up, then another option is to sell the thing.
Right.
But there's still that option.
Well, that's an option. The only problem is then you got to find somewhere to live. So you're going to sell. You're going to need to move out of Miami, because
that's the other thing. You sell and go where, right?
Right. That's a big question. Well, Will, listen, it has been an absolute pleasure. Always love chatting with you and hanging out. And
anytime, man. Anytime.
One of the cool things is, that we've got a core from law school in '91 that continues to stay close friends and
No,
having
I
dinner
don't.
and drinks all that time is.
I wonder if there's any other class that
pure
does
joy.
that in our section. I don't think so.
I don't know. We're blessed to have the crew that we do. So, and I'm blessed to count you as a friend and lawyer, and hopefully Will's one we can start to take off the kill list now. You know, not a bad guy. Apparently he can bartend if he's not working as a lawyer. So, you know, it's nice to know you got a good skill set.
Oh, yeah.
Will.
There's something to fall back on.
There you go. All right.
All right.
Pleasure, my friend.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Nice. I appreciate you having me.
You got it, my friend. All right.
Thanks.
That's another episode of First Off, Let's Kill All the Lawyers, and we'll see you next week.